for example. You see Schindler's List and you've never experienced the Holocaust, but somehow you are affected by that film in a way that wounds you and disturbs something about you as a human being, that forces you to empathize with that experience, right? So it changes you essentially.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with your host, writer and scholar of genocide studies, Sabah Karim. I am your co-host, Luis Gonzalez Aponte.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba is an accomplished scholar with a deep expertise in African and African Black diaspora literatures, as well as genocides and mass atrocities. Anyaduba's work critically examines the ways in which literature and memory shape our understanding of historical and contemporary injustices. In this episode, we explore his insights on the limitations of memory as a remedy in post-conflict societies and the importance of addressing structural violence. Please enjoy our conversation.
Hi, Arthur. It's nice to have you on our platform today. I would like to discuss in more detail one of the papers that you published recently. And this one is basically titled Memory / Remedy Against a Soothsayer's Practice, which you wrote together with Benjamin Mayangwa. And it has been published in the Oxford Handbook of Transitional Justice in September 2023. Now, I have many questions on the topic of memory in general. And this is a statement you make in the abstract of the article. So I want to start with this question. How does memory act as a remedy to historical injustices?
First, thanks a lot, Sabah, for this opportunity to chat with you and share some insights about my work. At the same time, I want to thank Luis, who is behind the scenes making this happen. So to the question, so first is to be clear that we are actually arguing against, in that essay that you cited, we were arguing against the idea of memory as a remedy, right? So just to have that upfront. But the idea of memory as remedy is something we observed that seems to be gaining increasing traction in the context of transitional justice or post-conflict situations. And we thought that that's remarkable and interesting, also because of the context of interest in African context, and the ways that memory, and by memory we mean what is generally now known as collective memory. In other words, the idea it is not that you have a memory of an atrocity and I also have a memory of. That's not generally what we mean. This is more of a group notion of memory, a memory that a group shares. In the context of mass atrocity, kind of social memory of an atrocity. And usually such kinds of social memory of atrocities come from cultural representations. The ways that an atrocity had been represented in cultural forms, through storytelling, through art, but also through commemorative practices, monuments, and so on. So we thought that increasingly many societies, or post-conflict societies, if you like, are now activating the notion of memory practices, such as truth and reconciliation commissions, or commemorative events and practices as a way to remedy past injustices or even contemporary or present forms of injustices. And so that was something that we found remarkable. There's the idea of soothsayer. It's a kind of metaphor that we use to grapple with that, and that metaphor I found very profound. It came out from the Rwandan context in a work by Veronique Tajo, a travel memoir in 1998, when she and a group of 9 other African writers visited Rwanda to commemorate in writing the genocide. So in her book, she tells this fascinating story. You know, the book is a chain of different kinds of stories that she goes there as a collector of stories. So she collects different kinds of stories about the genocide and puts it together in this fascinating book. And there's this particular story that we found really profound as an anecdote to what we described as memory as remedy. It's a story about a ghost that refuses to go after it has died. Someone has been brutally killed and beheaded, and the ghost refuses to die, to leave the community, and then goes about knocking on people's doors, and people were afraid. Because the ghost refuses to leave, there's this disorder of the natural way things are supposed to be that caused torrential rainfall. So discerning people in society felt, yeah, how do we solve this problem of a ghost refusing to transit, to die, essentially? So they call this Soothsayer, who says, well, let me try my best and enact this profound ritual of appeasement to beg the ghost to leave. But the nature of the ritual was first to hear the ghost out. So he pleads with the ghost to speak, makes the context conducive for testimony, right? And the ghost begins to talk and vent and speak to how he has been brutally killed and that experience. After which the Soothsayer appeases and apologizes to the ghost on behalf of our community, and then begs the ghost to die. That was live society. So the ritual essentially succeeds in getting rid of the ghost and the rain stopping, and sort of a social harmony, beginning of a new kind of social harmony emerging out of that ritual. And we saw that story as a metaphor for how many societies attempt to deal with atrocities, mass atrocities, past and present. In Canada, in recent years, there was also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission enacted in that form of bringing survivors of the Indian residential school to tell stories about their experiences and rituals of apologies and sorry and forgiveness kinds of narratives, all in the business of reconciliation or social healing, some kind of beginning processes of healing. In Rwanda, some aspects of what Tajo narrated in that story also took place. Even in the Gachacha court, traditional court process, you also had that kind of social engagement, testimony giving, leading to some kind of reconciliation and social healing and so on. South Africa is a very good example of that. Many other societies tried that. Sierra Leone in the 2000s, after the long civil war, also enacted a kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, founded on that kind of storytelling practice to bring about social harmony, right? So many societies. Nigeria tried the terrible one that failed massively, and so. And we felt there's something going on with these kinds of the ritual of healing. First is what it does in terms of framing of atrocity. So if we take that story in and of itself in its metaphorical gap, but what caused this ghost beheading? The very condition of ghostliness. What caused it, and how does that ritual address that? In the ritual itself, it doesn't address anything. The ritual seems to be designed to exorcise the ghost, troubling society. So it's a very exorcist practice, not to contend with the very conditions or structures of violence that produced the ghost, but to cure society's conscience, guilt, confronting these ghosts that constantly reminds it of the grave injustice done to it. So we thought that many of such practices are like this Soothsayer's exorcist ritual. They do not address the preconditions, structures of violence. They are more invested in exorcising the ghost of history in order to sort of obscure or conceal the very structures and conditions of violence that continue to produce violence, and they are very present, for which that ghost is in fact present. So yeah, that was that's and that idea of memory as remedy as it has also intellectual grounding. It has psychological uh, uh, context for how people understand the project of memory as some form of healing. Freudian psychoanalysis is also founded on that idea, and some other scholars had even traced it to ancient philosophies such as Plato's the allegory of the cave and all that. The idea being that for us to become something, so for us to know who we are, to find some kind of healing of beingness, we need to recollect something about us in the past, or pull it out from the unconscious and exercise dangerous memories that we probably do not remember anymore, but they are repressed in the world of the unconscious and so on. So alien societies, how do you deal with that? They had to go back to the world of the unconscious, where these ghosts reside, from where they could haunt society constantly, right?
So what you're doing is like basically you're questioning the truism that among which is of course widely accepted truth, right, by the scholarly community, that the way to one of the ways of meting out transitional justice, of a transitional justice mechanism, is through the confessional method, which is to go out there to encourage people to make a confession and to say, this is what we did, and to actually expect some form of healing through it. And I think that's the basis of truth and reconciliation commissions and committees across the world. That's also the basis of a lot of the projects of memorializations that exist. And I remember reading very recently this statement by one of a scholar who said, well, statues that are supposedly commemorative are only for the birds, right? And I thought that was, of course, I was very amused by that. But the point is that I think there are a lot of people who are very skeptical about a lot of these projects of memorialization. On one hand, we want to keep the memory alive. We want to perpetuate this, of course, the adage of never again. And one of the ways in which we want to perpetuate it is by making sure we remember what's happened so that it's not repeated. But I think what you're doing by coming in and questioning that tourism is perfect, because we should never accept anything, right? The moment we accept it, then thought is dead, there's dogma, and of course, it will only lead to stupid results. So what you're doing here is that you are questioning whether memorialization of the projects of memorialization have been effective so far. Now, in your paper, you speak about the importance of forgetting, therefore the opposite. And I want you to be able to tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, so first is you mentioned something about remembering in order not to repeat the mistakes of the past and so on. That in fact is one of the myths that we addressed in that, because it's not true. That very idea that if we do not remember the past, then we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past in the present or in the future and so on. But in contemporary times, we do have memories of horrible, nasty atrocities in the past, and we are still committing present atrocities. So those memories did not in any way prevent us from continuing being violent, right? So that in and of itself, I mean, it's a myth. But that's one of the assumptions on which this idea of memory as remedy stands, right? But the very project of memory itself, for those, and we have to also acknowledge that there are contexts in which memory is very useful. It does its work, and for very good reasons. African context, As a very good example, colonization, one of the violence colonizers attempted to do on Africa was to destroy memory, Africa's understanding of itself, the past, and to wipe it out. I mean, materially and metaphysically, culturally, and in different forms. So it was important for different societies to attempt to recover something about their past through different ways in which that project was enacted in different societies. So that we understand why it made sense. But that as a remedy in and of itself is a different question. But projects of memory, like mourning, they actually address to forgetting. It's a way actually of forgetting, which is the argument some folks make that we shouldn't remember, we should aim much more to forget. Because the more we remember past injustices, the danger might be that we might get so overwhelmed by it. We might get very angry and then resort to violent means to redress what we are recalling. So that the best approach should be to find ways to forget. Just let the past go and let's move on. After all, we don't have memory of far distant past, how societies came to be in different forms, and that not having such memories allowed us to invent new ways of living together, reinvent ourselves, and move on. That for peace to reign, we in fact need to forget. However, the challenge to that is that forgetting is in fact not really possible in the way in which it's proposed. And who forgets and for what reason? Because again, powerful systems, especially systems implicated in violence, actually weaponize amnesia as one way in which to cover up what they've done, for which, in fact, memory of atrocities get repressed and turn into these kinds of ghosts that return in different ways to haunt society, right? So yeah, but those who propose memory as remedy, I don't think they are against forgetting, because the project of mourning, for which the idea of memory as remedy is activated, is to mourn and then forget, to manage the traumatic memory that goes, and gradually live with it in such a way that you can forget it.
And I think I also like how you brought in the idea of transgenerational trauma into the picture, where you spoke about in your paper how when you don't forget and you carry on that harm to the generations that come up to you, you're traumatizing them. And that's a form of transgenerational trauma, right? Or what we call intergenerational trauma, which is, of course, a very big topic that, keeps coming up in genocide studies, but also, other areas of work, even in literature, as we know, there's so many people who've written about intergenerational trauma plays out in a whole family and across generations. So yes, please go on. I just wanted to mention this because I think this was very enlightening to me.
Yeah, I mean, that could also be those ghosts, right, that refuse to leave, and then they become, they manifest in different ways and become transgenerational, intergenerational, and in different ways in which that ghost manifests. But our core argument is, in fact, that we should jettison this notion of trauma and the way trauma is invoked in the context of mass atrocities. So the language of trauma in the context of memory as remedy and commemorative practices assumes that society is traumatized, given this experience of mass atrocity, and requires some kind of healing. Or some kind of reconciling that leads to healing, but also different ways in which people can be reconciled and live peacefully. And how do we arrive at that? Truth. That you should know the truth, and it shall set you free. That truism again. And so yeah, those are the things we quarreled with. And our quarrel is simply that something or a couple of things are actually getting lost. because of the emphasis on trauma healing. Not because there's no prospect for people healing from mass atrocity experiences, but because of the ways in which the project of memory had reframed our understanding of mass atrocity, right? So usually it's how do we heal? Tell stories, and those stories will sort of help you grapple with the experience and heal and so on. And in the process, we forget the very political and structural conditions of violence that continue to produce injuries and wounds, and focus on the very symbolic or cultural or storytelling forms that we then deprive of their political value because of the emphasis on trauma and healing. Right? So they become more moral, ethical technologies for addressing some abstract ethics, but not the very structures of violence. So that was what we were more interested in, how storytelling of the kind addressed to the idea of memory as remedy distract from conditions of violence that remain present in the business of exercising these ghosts. So yeah, that was our major goal. And if you look at specific context, South Africa, that people hailed as a very success story of the TRC working. In fact, the very story of the TRC obscured the real victory in apartheid or post-apartheid South Africa. It wasn't because people gathered and told stories and people collected all these stories and there was commemoration and forgiveness and reconciliation and so on. The real victory was, in fact, the political enfranchisement of Black South Africans that allowed Black South Africans to vote and participate in governance, right? But that's not what people look at. We remember what happened. What they focus on is the TRC and the projects of healing. I'm not sure people got healed in the sense that, like, there are traumas that you can't heal from.
I'm very drawn to this idea of how we're not focusing on the right elements that happen, the right things that happen when we set up these truth and reconciliation committees. Because I also remember the work of Alex Hinton, the one that is titled The Justice Facade, that was based on the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, the ECCC that took place over a very extended period of time, and where Alex Hinton in that book talked about all the many ways in which there was, a conversation, for instance, began about the genocide that had not been discussed for the longest time since it happened between, in the 70s, in the late 70s. And how he basically hinted at the fact that, although, of course, setting up the tribunal was for the sake of furthering transitional justice, there were other things that happened on the site that we overlooked. For instance, just the fact of, say, a tuk-tuk driver driving someone to the tribunal in a very faraway place and sitting down with him and maybe having a cup of tea to say, why are we here? And then to start that conversation and say, we're here to discuss this genocide that happened many years ago, was already a means of starting that discussion. Now, whether this led to a cathartic result, whether this led to healing is something we obviously don't know. And I think it's great that what we're putting forward here as a thought, Arthur, is the fact that in everything to do with human beings, to expect that there will be definite results out of, say, a conversation is a little bit idealistic, a bit romantic even, And so I think we have to be very grounded in realizing that as scholars, as people who are activists as well in the field, we can only hope for certain results to be produced out of all of these steps we take.
And also to look at the very projects of TRCs as grounded in the politics of power, right? So there's a work they are doing, but for whom are they doing that work, right? In many contexts, they do the work of maintaining the status quo of power by alleviating of giving people a sense that they are the kinds of problems they have with the state, for example, they are being alleviated, right? So think of the word reconciliation generally evoked in these kinds of contexts. There's actually in many cases no basis for that vocabulary. Because to reconcile, if, for example, we have a quarrel and we've had this moment of conciliation before the quarrel, and we are being reconciled, is to return us to that prior relationship of conciliation. But in many of these contexts, there wasn't any kind of prior relationship of conciliation that will be reconciled. Is it in the context of colonization and genocide in the Americas? For example, in Canada, there wasn't any moment of conciliation between settlers and indigenous peoples here. Same as in South Africa. There wasn't a moment of conciliation between colonizers and Black indigenous South Africans. And so same in many other contexts. So what happens is systems of power rely on these rituals to normalize a condition, distract from the very structures of violence, and focus on healing and trauma. You are broken, so let's facilitate that process of healing. Tell us your stories, and they cannibalize people based on the kinds of stories they try to get from them, in order, in fact, to exorcise the very ghosts that constantly charges society of injustice, right? So that exorcism is what we find, in fact, very pernicious in this project of memory.
And also the stage theory, right? Like whenever we hear about, for instance, when you mourn, you have to go through denial, anger, depression, acceptance. And we all know that we can't rely on these as definite conditions. So even when we speak about healing or reaching a certain cathartic point in the process, it's not like somebody's healed and there's catharsis and he's going to go home and everything's going to be okay thereafter. He can get back those feelings of anger or violence or whatever at any point in time. They can come back. So I think it's great that we're questioning the basis of, again, these truisms, as we say, right, that we take for granted in everything that we are in the material that's given to us. And so on one hand, just to summarize whatever we've talked about so far, on one hand, we do acknowledge the importance of remembering, right? So we think as a basis, we lay our assumptions on the fact, our assumptions are that we need to remember so as not to repeat. First of all, we know that we will repeat even if we remember. And then I also think a bit of a digression here. I also think very often of how, especially because we're talking of the elections here in America, and every time there's any talk about elections anywhere in the world for that matter, there are always people who come up with, statements about how people don't remember how such and such person did whatever in the past, and now they look at them, they're voting for the person again. They don't remember, right? So on one hand, we want people to not forget, right? In these contexts, we blame people for the holes of memory, right, in their system that stops them from making the right decision. So what happens is that there is an arbitrary forgetting and remembering that's happening in every individual. We also, by the way, speak about how important it is to forget, for instance, birth pangs, because we say that if women remembered birth pangs, they would never have more children, So there you go. You have moments when you have to remember and you don't, and there are moments when you have to forget and you don't. So my question then, or, as a means to find the juste milieu in this whole confusion, this whole chaos of memory, of remembering and forgetting. My question is, as genocide scholars, how do we think ahead, or how do we make sure that we establish a certain golden mean, a certain sort of proportionate way of approaching the project of memorialization, of remembering, which is important. We can't say it's not. But at the same time of making sure that we also implement means of forgetting. Because I know about active means of implementing mechanisms to remember, but I don't think we speak about implementing means to forget, which obviously, just by saying it right now, I can imagine how many people will be very upset at just the thought of forgetting anything at all. But as we pointed out in this little chat we had so far, it is important to forget because of, for instance, transgenerational trauma, it's important to forget also, for the very many other reasons or it's not important to forget, but we do forget, and it's a natural part of our system. So back to you, my question is, how do we establish that golden mean, that juste milieu?
I mean, that's a very complex, but also very profoundly important question. And I think it's to go back a little bit to understand that memory in the context in which we are discussing it, for me, is a work of representation, right? It's not that there's an exact thing that I remember about the past that remains authentic and true and unchanging. As against that, projects of memory are works of cultural representations, the ways people tell stories. And a lot of stories people tell, for example, in the context of testimony, they are testimony stories, atrocity testimonies. So they are telling these stories in order to testify to something. Someone else could tell the story in a very different way. That is not to testify. It could be a tragic story, it could be a comedy that might not necessarily be functioning as a testimonial, but doing a different kind of work. And it could also be a victorious kind of story to legitimize power, to mock, to ridicule people who have suffered, or to justify a particular violence in contexts where perpetrators of atrocities are victorious and remain victorious. Usually they tell stories about the atrocities as the right thing to do, as a way of defending themselves and in the ways in which they are still memories, but represented in different ways. So it's how these memorials are representing the past for us, generating different ways of engagement, different kinds of meanings that we are looking at here. And we are saying in the context of memory as remedy, they are often generated as stories addressed to testimonials and trauma healing in a way that then reframes the understanding of atrocity, what that past meant and how we are interacting or encountering that past in memories. So yeah, that's but how, again, you can't tell people how to represent experiences, and even sometimes the interpretation of a particular work of representation could differ in a way that different groups could use the same kind of story for different means, different interpretations, and push towards different ends. Interestingly, so that's a very human condition, the complexity of what we are dealing with, the fact that nothing remains exactly anything. It's how we choose to frame and reframe that, for which we think, in fact, it's not in these in the ways in which the discourse on trauma and healing that we should find the answers to correct, redressing or addressing some of these problems. It has to be somewhere else, because that discourse focuses on something that doesn't actually change anything about what has happened. It's just more of the symbolic, as against addressing the structural preconditions or conditions of violence. So if we ask, what is, so take post-colonial, and I indicate post-colonial in quotes because there's no post-colonial anyway. It's still a very colonial system we have in Africa, but let's use that in the post-independence African context, known for mass violence in different, there's rarely any decade since the 1960s that you don't have horrible mass violence producing thousands, scores, and if not millions of deaths in different African contexts, right? How do we deal with that? Using testimonials, telling about what had happened and so on. Gathering people to share stories that are more or less familiar. If you listen to testimonies from Rwanda, they sound very similar to testimonies from Burundi, the testimonies in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, and so on, across different parts of Africa. Those stories sound alike. What do we do with that? How does that heal anything? Does it rather distract us from asking, well, what is actually producing these kinds of violence in Africa, and how do we deal with that? What exactly is causing that? Are they political? Are they economic? Like, what kinds of structures are producing that violence in Africa? And why are we not thinking of how to deal with that in very serious ways, right? And questions about justice. How do we deal with situations of injustice that result from these kinds of mass atrocity experiences? By healing, is that a form of justice? What kind of justice is that? Especially in societies where perpetrators continue to live in the same community with victims or survivors. That was the case in Rwanda, in the case in Sierra Leone, Liberia, the case in Nigeria. And there are very complex conditions. For example, where kids participated in killing. What do you do with the kids? Thousands of them. Do you jail them? Do you kill them? What do you do with them? So these are not easy stuff. But when we frame things around trauma healing and memory as remedy, I think we distract from asking the right questions that probably will allow us to understand much more what's good.
I completely agree with you. So I think what is very clear from this conversation is that the value of testimony, the value of speaking about trauma, of the confessional in this whole sort of like move towards transitional justice has to be evaluated has to be used for different reasons than just geared towards, for instance, healing. So by studying these patterns, these testimonies, I think you mentioned the patterns in Africa, I would say the patterns across the world as well, all the violence that's suffered across different countries. So there is merit in using these testimonies to analyze patterns of violence. And also, I do remember one of the guests I had on the platform here spoke about how there is a certain, if you, for instance, analyze patterns of violence, you notice that there are patterns of violence against the same community repeatedly over a long periods of time. And maybe therein lies also a merit in remembering, right? Whereby then we can record these acts of these atrocities against these populations to record this consistent attack over a long period of time. I mean, we're now, of course, we're talking about Palestine, and now we're turning back into history and looking at what happened during the Nakba, and we're also looking at how these patterns of violence are similar against all the different cities across Palestine, right? So when we're looking at all of this, it's important to tap into the recurrence of these events. But at the same time, what I'm thinking about right now is on the issue of memory and forgetting and remembrance. I'm also thinking about some of the other terms you introduced into the article, which are relevant to me, I think, even as a writer, as a creative writer, where you employed words such as prosthetic memory. We have memory, which I think what you alluded to was when you borrow from the experiences of other people and you make them your own and you write about them. Could you tell us more about that?
I think we mentioned that a little bit marginally because it wasn't at the heart of what we were saying, but also because I believe we were a bit critical of that. And again, prosthetic memory, going back to Landsberg's work, the notion, it functions again as cultural representation. It's how people encounter other people's or the atrocity memories prosthetically, through or vicariously through cultural representations, through watching a film. For example, you see Schindler's List and you've never experienced the Holocaust, but somehow you are affected by that film in a way that wounds you and disturbs something about about you as a human being that forces you to empathize with that experience, right? So it changes your section, and you go with that to engage subsequently. So that's part of what I think Landsberg was interested in, the empathy that atrocity experiences that we have not experienced for ourselves could cause in us, provoke for us in our encounter with cultural representation. That very interesting theory of memory, but also very problematic way of thinking about atrocity memory as I see it, because it assumes that I have to identify in order to empathize. The way in which I connect with that kind of memory that I haven't experienced is through this kind of prosthetic binding. In other words, it has to become me. I have to, for example, I don't have a hand, and you attach this artificial hand to mine. It has to become part of me in order for me to connect with it. If for whatever reason it doesn't, then it has failed. If empathy hasn't happened in the way she defines our empathy, it means it hasn't fully functioned in the right way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any problem. When we watch Roots, we will be happy with, we'll empathize with Black people, but that's not true. We've seen a lot of films about Black experiences where we are still oppressing Black people and killing Black people, place shooting and so on. So it hasn't really achieved that prosthetic thing. And another theory is multidirectional memory that assumes that the kinds of meanings we come into about one particular atrocity experience, usually it's the product of the entanglements of that atrocity with other atrocities. So even the Holocaust is not on its own a thing. It came into being through mixing and entangling with other atrocities, especially atrocities in Africa, but also slavery and other atrocity experiences across different parts of the world, in Vietnam War and so on. So that again is different ways in which people are thinking about how atrocity memories work, how we interact with them, the way we come into different kinds of meanings about them, and the ways they are supposed to either affect us or not, and so on.
The way in which prosthetic memory ignited, or rather marked me when I was reading your paper was because I immediately thought about, for instance, Will Kominsky, who was accused of writing a fake memoir. It was scandalous because he claimed to be a Holocaust survivor. And there was a whole discussion that began in the aftermath where the question was, are you allowed to write a fake memoir about a genocide? And I thought when you mentioned the word prosthetic memory, I started to think about that because I was wondering if in this world where in the world of writing, for instance, we're now told over and over again that we can't, for instance, try to speak about somebody else's experience of life if we're talking about a person of a different identity, for instance, because that amounts to stealing the person's narrative, and we may, for instance, represent the person in a mistaken way, and therefore we are cautioned against doing that as creative writers. And I think there's a very big discussion about it that's still going on. And writers such as Zadie Smith, I remember her great essay called Fascinated to Presume in Defense of Fiction, where she takes a contrarian view and speaks about the importance of being someone else, of trying to, empathize with different people around us and creating these different characters so as to actually, engage with these other people's realities. And I'm completely for that perspective, for that point of view in terms of writing. But going back to, again, prosthetic memory, and maybe that's my reading of it, and it's probably entirely different from what it was meant. But I often imagine, being both a creative writer and a genocide scholar, what it would be like if I were to write a fictional account of a genocide. And, when Will Kominsky, for instance, was accused, and I think he was called out by the New Yorker as being a memory thief, for what he did. And then there were subsequent discussions where some commentators said that the very fact that people are creating fake memoirs such as him shows that there is an abundance of literature out there on the Holocaust that people can actually fake them, so it shows how, in fact, we have been very triumphant in documenting that atrocity, that people can now reproduce it, without having even experienced it. So I'm getting into many different branches of conversation here, but just to stick to the point, just to go back to the point, the question that came to my mind when I read this term that you used in the article you wrote, which is, prosthetic memory, is to what extent is it ethical? And that's, of course, a very subjective evaluation. But how ethical is it to write about another person's experience of genocide? How ethical is it, or how possible is it to empathize with another person's experience of genocide? I think you and I have had a discussion previously also about how in many conferences across America, across, many other countries also, not just America, but whenever the concept of the context, whenever the subject of genocide comes up, the local audience often starts referring to other examples of violence in the country. And in America specifically, the audience, largely relates to school shootings, because that's something that's deemed relatable because it happens here so often. It's constantly in the news. And also because it is, of course, there are instances of extreme violence, and that's the closest an American audience can come to in terms of understanding genocide, the genocide that's experienced in other countries, right? So yeah, there are many questions here, but this is just a way of telling you that the term prosthetic memory stirred up all of these thoughts.
I mean, and you're very right. I don't think Landsberg would disagree with you on the way you've read prosthetic memory, because I think part of the project was, in fact, to counter the criticisms of the commodifications of atrocity experiences or memories, and in fact, advocate for the kinds of empathy and connection, and there's ways of using other people's memory as one's own, as something very positive and politically admirable, right? But it's one thing to write about. I don't think I'm against writing about other people's experiences. Yes, that should in fact be done, and people are doing that. Or empathizing with other people's experiences. That's, of course, so many writers, if not most writers, who write about these kinds of things. That's the goal. You want people to empathize with these experiences. But that's different from faking or lying about an experience, right? That isn't yours. So that's like lying. And that suggests a different kind of intentionality. Again, commodifying someone else's experience and taking advantage of it because you wield some kind of cultural or social capital to be able to do that. But there are also very genuine reasons why people fight against these kinds of appropriations, if you like. Given again history of colonization and the fact that we don't have an equal cultural market, right? If I say something and one white professor somewhere else says the same thing, the possibility that people will hear me is way lower compared to that guy. Or is, it could be institution, it could be race, it could be different kinds of things, right? So we are dealing with something really complex here, but also a history of oppression and denial of voice and agency to people that activated these kinds of gatekeeping. Who tells whose story? When white folks, white Europeans kept telling African stories, for example, or Africans, misrepresenting things, writing stories that normalize the violence Europeans did to Africans or continue to do to Africans, then there has to be some kind of suspicion. There has to be gatekeeping of who writes about African experiences and why, to what end. So that's, I think, part of why you have these kinds of agitations and people being worried and anxiety over that. But on the other hand, I don't disagree that people should engage with other people's experiences. In fact, connect much more. But in the context of trauma, it even becomes very difficult. In trauma literatures deal much more with people's own voice, their own experience. They own it. It's authentic when they tell it. You cannot tell my trauma because you don't know that trauma, as though I already know my trauma. In fact, traumatized people don't actually understand their trauma. That's because to understand it is usually not to be traumatized, right? So sometimes you need another perspective, another gaze upon the subject of trauma, and it's not just one voice. And there are the Rwandan example. In 1998, a group of African writers, 10 of them, most of them, only 2 of them are Rwandans. The other 8 of them were other Africans from different countries, Kenya, Senegal, different parts of Africa, Chad, and so on. And they visited Rwanda to write about the genocide. And the books or the works they produced out of that project had remained very profound and helped to inaugurate a new way of thinking about the genocide, different from how Western writers were writing about what happened and so on. So people had done that successfully, if you like, in some other context. So and it wasn't unethical, but they still had to grapple with these kinds of questions that we qualify to write this genocide, about this genocide. Whose memory? Because the project was called Rwanda Writing as a Duty to Memory.
It's also starting to make me review what I've experienced living in different countries. When, for instance, in Malaysia, when I was in Malaysia, there was a big critique about the omission of certain key events, historical events in Malaysian history, for instance, the Japanese occupation and the atrocities committed by them in the country, which are not mentioned, overtly in history books and not taught to students. So a lot of people feel there that it's a form of denial, right, of what happened. And then you also of course, in America, we speak about what happened to Native Americans, but now that has changed over the last few decades or so, where we're increasingly speaking about that and making it, more obvious than it has ever been. So the question is then, taking active steps to stop discussing a historical event that was violent, and sorry, but a quick digression as well, because now I remember also these conversations with my friends from Iran who would keep speaking about, the attacks on their country, the bouts of violence of their country by, the Muslims from the Arab, the Arab world, in, again, a historical event that transformed the country and robbed them from some of their very deeply ingrained practices, including their own religion at the time of Zoroastrianism. And how even 2,000 years later, I remember documenting this in my diary then, this was still a conversation that very young Iranians who were my age then, we were all students in our early 20s, were still talking about. So how do some people go on to discuss this violence that may have happened thousands of years before and still make them worth remembering, events worth remembering? This is a very important subject. I also want to now, if you don't have any other comments on this, but I want to discuss the details before we end of the idea of collective memory. What does collective memory mean for you?
The idea that that a particular experience, a particular event is experienced as a group or as a collective, and then remembered as such, right? So if, for example, there's a war, So collective memories usually function in the context of um, events that affect groups of people in society, like wars, mass atrocities, genocides, but also some good things, football games, winning a particular tournament and championships and so on, right? So things like that. Uh, but what exactly is that memory? Where is it? Is it how specific individuals remember it and then they come together to remember that? That would be impossible to collect, right? But what happens is over time, there are maybe cultural institutions out there that distill and pick what becomes collective memory, right? Again, based on cultural representation. It could be a few individuals who are interviewed and whatever they've said collected as representative account of an event that becomes some kind of reference to that event that produces a collective memory. It could be a museum dedicated to something. Within that museum, you have different representations that all work together to form this thing we call collective memory. It could be works of art, stories, literatures, and so on. But the thing about collective memory is that it's not one specific individual's memory. An individual's memory could then function as an example for the collective, so that, and collective trauma, to extend that, also functions in that way. So,
I think what's scary is the possibility that a lot of this could also be fabricated. What about fabricated collective memory? And the reason I say that is because I'm actually thinking about how, when I was doing my research on, memoir literature recently, and this is ongoing. I think I've kept mentioning this on the podcast, but that's because I'm working on a paper right now for an edited volume on that. And one of the subjects that keeps coming up is how, when, people wanted to testify about what happened during the Holocaust, many of them, and the director of Yad Vashem spoke about it, and this is why I came across that mention in the book, where there was this questioning of these confessions recorded and collected, right, of what happened during the Holocaust. And there was a tendency that was detected of, borrowing accounts from other people, and also borrowing accounts from facts, which were already mentioned in newspapers and things, and making them your own. So for instance, if you experience trauma in a certain area and you don't remember that area because you read that people were traumatized in that area, you sort of borrow that memory, you make it your own, and you say, I was there when the person was probably not there. So I'm not speaking about concocting, violence or concocting traumatic incidents from scratch. I'm not going there at all. But what I'm saying is how memory can be built over time based on it being borrowed from different people or different accounts. I think Schindler's List, for that matter, because you mentioned the movie, was one of the most triggering pieces of art, because it triggered, not in the conventional sense of triggering, but it triggered a wave of survivors who actually, experienced trauma to come forward and, speak about their stories. Because when you're given a form, right, to represent something, you finally know how to package it. And I think we know this both as creative writers, you and I, that sometimes all we need is the right kind of form to understand how it works. And then what we go about doing is we package it with our own stories and our own experiences. So I think that's what Schindler's List triggered. And I think, as I said, the idea of collective memory triggers this alarm because of this one reason I just mentioned, how a lot of it could be concocted, one. And secondly, I also remember this incident, this account I read about Lung. So Lung is a Cambodian genocide survivor, and she is the author of First They Killed My Father, which was adapted which was adapted recently and turned into a film directed by Angelina Jolie. And I remember reading two or three articles about how Lung Eng has been criticized because the title of her book is First They Killed My Father, and the subheading is Daughter of Cambodia. And people criticize her because, first of all, she did not give a proper account about how old the Angkor Wat, the temples, were. And she also gave the details of a recipe, a famous Khmer dish, a noodle dish. And she mentioned adding cilantro to it. And, it triggered a wave of protest because some of the Cambodians said that we don't add cilantro to that dish, and therefore obviously insinuating how dare she, make up these memories, or rather how dare she, call herself the daughter of Cambodia when she doesn't know the recipe for something that is so authentically Khmer. So when it comes to collective memory, I have these alarm bells ringing in my head because of these two reasons of how much pressure there is, for instance, on authors like Lung Eng, on survivors like Lung Eng, because they hold that responsibility, to give a true account. And we all know how the word authentic and true is, so politically charged. What is truth, and who holds the truth? Who has the right to tell the story in the way they want? And do we have to double check everything we say about something that we experience before we actually write it down? So that's what I'm saying. Do you have any thoughts about all this?
Yeah, so I think just to go back a bit, collective memory, it is fabricated, so we understand it clearly. There's nothing authentic about it. It's a fabrication. And I don't mean it in the negative sense that people are deliberately manipulating things. I mean it in the sense that it's constructed. It's a work of social construction, right? yeah, and the work of imagination usually. So it's not something out there that people reflect for what it is, as it is a produced thing. Again, collective memories is a concept from the 1920s. I used to challenge historiography, especially when history was written for the state, and official histories of states' accounts of how things were, how the past was, and so on. So people could then talk to specific individuals who lived through a photograph or letters written, could then challenge aspects of official history and so on. So that was part of how the concept evolved over time. But I'm saying that what becomes collective memory is a product of academic scholarship as against what is out there in the real world. So someone's story could become part of what is considered collective memory. And even that story itself, the way it's told, the context in which it's generated and so on, is a work of fabrication, even if it's something that happened to the person really actually in real life, right? So again, testimonies. Let's use those testimonies. Your Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you invite survivors of the particular atrocity, and they tell stories. You invite perpetrators, bystanders, and all the different groups, actors and players. They all tell stories, and we pull these stories together and say, well, these form the collective memory of that atrocity. But we know that these stories are told in a particular context for a particular reason. Different kinds of things would have gone into that. I'm telling something the way I've recollected it at that moment, which might be different if you call me again and I start telling that story all over. So together, it's a work produced, constructed, and within a particular historical moment. It's a work of fabrication, essentially.
Shall we push it further and say, I would go on to say, again, based on my reading, it's not just collective memory that's fabricated or that's a work of art. It's the act of remembering. Therefore, the act of just sitting down, not just necessarily to write, but to remember and to even orally transmit a story is actually going to be fabricated to a certain extent.
Because you recall from your imagination. So recalling is already fiction, right? So it's not, so any attempt, even though it's based on what happened to someone, what they experienced in real life, recalling it is a very different thing. So you're already writing it and narrating it and organizing it in a particular way to make it meaningful. But the experience itself wasn't organized or narrated in that sense. So it's not meaningful in that sense. But to recall it and narrate it, there's already that fictionality because you are plotting it, you are giving it a different life. So collective memory is a work of fabrication. That's very, I don't think that's in contention at all. What is in contention is the project, how it's being used in different ways, and it's always contested. Different groups will always contest different aspects of what comes to be categorized as collective memory. In fact, there's rarely think of slavery. What is the collective memory of slavery? There's no one narrative about slavery. There are diverse aspects of the experience that you can then put together. So it's always in tension with disagreements with different aspects of what people don't agree with. But the larger picture is that it's a work of fabrication dedicated to different kinds of projects. And in our own work, we are more interested in how it's being used as a way to remedy past injustices and then obscuring questions about the structures that continue to produce violence.
So we've talked about memory, we've talked about prosthetic memory, we've talked about collective memory, we've talked about the virtues of remembering and forgetting, but there's one more type of memory that I'm remembering right now, which I came across not in an academic work, but in a work of fiction recently, in a short story. And this was the idea of borrowed memory. And I like that. For me, it's different from prosthetic memory, although it sounds the same. Borrowed memory for me is, in the context that I was reading it, and I find that fascinating, is when, say, you hear your mother say that, you know, my mother-in-law, your grandmother, used to come to me and, you know, show me how to wear the sari and tie a knot or whatever it is. And then this mother, your mother, goes on to give the details about how that was done. And so suddenly, as you grow older, that becomes part of your memory because you remember that grandmother coming and showing your mother how to tie a sari, and yet you were not there when it happened. And so that just becomes part of everything that is you, and that, you know, you remember with the clearest of imagination, yet you were not there.
I mean, that's fascinating. I haven't heard of a borrowed memory, but what you describe now is familiar, right? And it's again part of culture, part of heritage, forms of memory, traditionalist aspects of memory as well. But very fascinating. And sometimes you hear people say things like, oh yeah, like my grandma used to say, and so on. And probably they never actually heard it directly from their grandma, but from their mom. but he referenced the grandma, and it becomes this thing, this authority that is invisible, that allows for some kind of wisdom to emerge. I mean, that's interesting, but borrowed. But to use borrowed then suggests that you are lending it and you return it, right? So
yes, but I don't think I'd be too literal there, because I don't see how in that sense that memory would be returned, unless it's about, by writing about it, you're returning
or transferring it to another. So you borrowed it from the future, from the children, and you borrowed it from them to give to the children.
Yes.
In which again it connects it to that notion of heritage and
or even like you're just transmitting a memory from, you know, inside your home, and you're putting it in writing and you're transmitting it to the world. So I think that's where you going forward or pushing that idea of borrowing a memory, you know, makes sense. But the other thing I want to say is, you know, we're both academics, we're both writers. I don't know whether you find this a challenge, but I personally find it extremely interesting whenever I hear or I learn about new concepts in academia, and then I want to use them in creative writing, but I don't want to become too technical so as not to lose my readerly, you know, crowd, which is more diverse, of course, in terms of their backgrounds and their knowledge, compared to a more, you know, focused, a more focused group of readers in the scholarly context, because most people would be from a genocide studies background. So I'm just saying that sometimes even these terms, like we talked about, as I said, I saw the term borrowed memory, and to be more specific, the author I read from used it in, to quote, in my borrowed memory, and then she went on to write whatever she had to write. But I'm just saying, if we had to use terms such as prosthetic memory and collective memory, and these terms which of course already have academic currency, if we were to use them in creative writing, how would we write them, and how would we make sure that we wrote them in a way where our audience, right, our diverse audience would be able to, our varied audience rather, would be able to understand what we really meant by them. That's
I mean, while you were talking, I just remember the Toni Morrison's beloved rememory, right, which is one of the most complex theories of memory I've encountered, and it's a fiction. And rememory, like scholars have been unpacking that in different ways, and it keeps meaning different things, keeps reemerging in different contexts. But the way it's described in the story, which I find really fascinating, is the idea of bumping into someone's memory. So an experience you never in your life encountered, that someone else experienced it and is there, and one day you just bump into that memory and suddenly realize, oh, but this is not my experience. How is it possible that I can encounter and experience this in this way, right? That I can remember it in this way. Like, well, what's that? And people have actually confessed to having that kind of experience of bumping into other people's memories of a particular encounter, say slavery and so on, or entering a house and feeling that you are leaving someone else's memory in the house that you couldn't explain. Like, what's that? Even that allows one to think about aspects of prosthetic memory.
But then you also have these theories about people believing that they are reincarnations, from the past because they have these experiences, right? So you have, these different ways in which memory plays out in the lives of different individuals, and how it takes on these different forms. It's quite fascinating. And I think what you're talking about is also the feeling of deja vu.
But the idea of rememory in Toni Morrison's work is powerful, right? So, and that's a writer who coins this theory and uses it in writing in very interesting ways. And there are many writers who actually use very big ideas, philosophical, and they write philosophical works, just essentially to explore those ideas in stories. There are so many of them. I think Milan Kundera, for example, does things like that.
I think Milan Kundera has also one of his novels called Memory and Forgetting. And I'm also now remembering, Nabokov, who writes one of my most favorite novels is, his novel Speak Memory. But back to Milan Kundera very quickly, I remember being very marked by, his work on memory when he spoke about, the experience of going back home, when you've left and you've been away for many years and you go back. And the first reaction of people is to speak to you as if you'd never left, without them realizing that here is a different individual who's left and been in a different country and changed and become something else and has maybe different hobbies and different passions. But it's an interesting experience when your own folks speak to you as if you're the same person and you've actually never left. And that's something I found very profound and meaningful, especially in this context of like memory and forgetting. Yeah, so you're right. I mean, even when we speak about, because we spoke about intergenerational trauma earlier, that's also a very common theme in many novels. Is it Gabriel Garcia Marquez who writes about the 100 Years of Solitude? He, of course, treats the subject of intergenerational trauma as well in detail. And I think that's the, canonical work on the subject. That's the most famous work on the subject. So yes, you're right. In fact, fiction allows us maybe to have, to explore these more complex, themes more directly and effectively than academia that expect new terms to be generated immediately once you've identified something.
Yeah, and you have to justify, and I think fiction, you are freer to explore and make mistakes, do whatever you want. There's more poetic license to doing stuff like that than academic writing that demands a different kind of engagement. You have to prove, you have to make sense of things for your reader and provide very logical, coherent argument. Yeah.
Rationalizations
Yeah.
that's expected of you in academia. That's true. Well, thank you so much, Arthur. We have spoken for the first time on the podcast, but this is not. This is just one of the many conversations we've had, and I've always enjoyed every one of them. So thank you very much for being a guest on this platform.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to chat with you, as always.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.